All right. Thank you very much, Jeff. All right, so I'd like to now go on to our next presenter is Don Ortner, who is the Vice President of ESPI, standing for Enterprise Systems Partners. He has over a decade of consulting experience, collaborating with C-level teams, functional management to implement changes leading to improved revenue, profitability. He deals with delivering new processes for strategies, delivering innovations, and improving operations. And he has worked with early-stage startups to global 200 companies. He has over 30 years in strategy, innovation, and systems. He is, before ESPI, he was a senior director and chief project manager at Mac and Volvo, where he developed two platforms representing over $2 billion in annual sales. He also teaches MBA-level courses in project management and international strategy at DeSales. He holds a master's in international business from the University of South Carolina. And when I asked for an anecdote, he told me he's an avid gardener, and he woke up this morning at the crack of dawn doing weeding in his garden. So I don't know. Please join me in welcoming Don Ortner.
Thank you, Zach. Welcome. So demand, hey, it's working. Good job back there. So demand-driven supply chain is something that's in a lot of the literature these days. How many of you have encountered demand-driven supply chain? A couple. How many of you have enacted demand-driven supply chain in your organizations? A couple of hands. All right. Well, we're going to talk about some of the fundamentals of demand-driven supply chain, but we're going to focus so that you have some distinct takeaways when you get back to your offices or back to home. So let's put it in the context. What do we mean? And one of the terms we sometimes use for demand-driven supply chain is smart planning. And I'll get back to why smart planning. So what is demand-driven supply chain? What we're talking about here is a systems approach, and it's important to think of it as a system to respond to the demand in real time. That's the ideal world. That's at its core. There's a lot of really great, 3-paragraph long academic definitions of demand-driven supply chain, but it all comes down to this. It's a systematic, whole business approach to responding to demand in as close to real time as we can. So what drives the need for demand-driven supply chain? Why don't we just, do like we've always done, right? It's not that hard. We'll just keep doing it. Well, how many of you feel that the world has gotten slower? No hands have gotten up? How about less complex? No, it's not gotten simpler for you either? I think earlier we had a couple of things talking about increased uncertainty in the world that we're working in. Digital uncertainty, supply chain uncertainty, all kinds of issues. And change. The pace of change continues to accelerate. All of these things drive us to want to lean out our process for delivering products to our customers, getting products to the customers, the right product to the customer when they want it. Ideal world, and I'll ask for a show of hands for which of you lives in this world. In an ideal world, in the morning, my customer places an order. I order the raw materials. They get delivered to me. The product is made. I deliver the product to the customer, and everybody's happy by the evening. Right? Because if in that ideal world, I haven't tied up working capital, not very long, it's only tied up for one day. The whole process works smoothly. I can get quick responses. The customer's happy, I'm happy, I don't have a huge inventory. So how many of you live in this world? Have any of you even experienced something even remotely close to this? But what we're trying to do is start approaching this ideal. Now, we will never achieve it. Nobody's kidding themselves. But if you look at your processes and your systems throughout your organization, This is the ideal we should be looking to, taking the waste out of the systems so that we can deliver with minimal disruption, with minimal working capital investment. I'm going to touch on this slide real quick because in our business, we believe very much in looking at business as an integrated system. And what we've been finding is that we work on the operations side of the business a lot. We have a whole team of people who does operations improvements, and we work a lot with lean principles. And what's really interesting here is if you look at the principles of demand-driven supply chain, those principles follow the principles of the 5 key principles of lean. So how many of you had some lean training? Okay, quite a few of you. So you've encountered these principles. You might not remember it, getting back to one of the earlier presentations about remembering things. But you've encountered this, and it turns out that all of these apply to the principle of demand-driven supply chain. But why do we want to do demand-driven supply chain? Who cares? Order to cash velocity. What we're trying to do is get from the point a customer places an order to the point where we receive cash from that customer to be as short as possible. And particularly when I start doing B2B, sometimes that length of time can be quite significant. And what we're seeing is that a lot of companies have had delays in invoicing, had delays in getting product out the door. All of these things lengthen our cash cycle. And cash is king in the end. If you look at the companies that went out of business during the COVID period, it usually wasn't because they had bad product or even a bad business model. It was because they ran out of cash. The second thing is inventory reduction. We want inventory. And the only reason we need inventory is because we haven't reached that ideal state, right? Where I can order the parts and get them the same day and then produce for the customer. So we need inventory, but we want the right inventory at the right time. And we don't want to have too much of it because, again, it ties up cash. And customer satisfaction. Many years ago, UPS was getting into trouble because this small startup company called FedEx was growing. And UPS looked at it and said, well, the reason FedEx is growing so fast is because they have 2-day delivery. At that time, it was only 2-day. There was no overnight. And so UPS started doing 2-day delivery. And UPS found that their customer satisfaction was not improving one bit. They were very frustrated. They put all this effort. They developed their supply chain. They developed their logistics. They developed new software so that they could meet FedEx's 2-day delivery. So they investigated further, and what they found out was the reason that their customer satisfaction hadn't improved was because they weren't telling their customers where their packages were. Right? We can all go online now. It's normal, right? To go online and say, where's my package? And we'll know that it's in Duluth, and we'll know that it's supposed to be in Lehigh Valley by 4 o'clock this afternoon. And the reason that we have that capability is because it turns out we really want that. We want to know where our package is. And it turns out that when I do demand-driven supply chain, I know better where their product is, so I can tell them where their product is. So there's some key success factors in this. One, I have to have real-time demand sensing. So that means I need to know right away what demand I have that is different than what I expected. And that's a key word here, key phrase, different than I expected. And we'll come back to that in a minute. I also need to make sure my whole enterprise is aligned to deliver this. Once again, it's a systematic approach. If my sales department says we're going to do demand-driven supply chain, but my purchasing department is on board, what's going to happen? It's going to fail. If my engineering department isn't on board, it's also going to fail. We all have to be integrated together to make this work. And that ties to the fact that it has to be a whole supply chain collaboration. So the problem with systems are they're complex, right? Remember we said the world's more complex? not one aspect of demand-driven supply chain is difficult. It's basically addition and subtraction. The problem is that there's a lot of it, and there's a lot of interactions, and that's what makes it difficult. If you take any one element, I guarantee you anyone in this room can manage one element of the demand-driven supply chain with no issues. The difficulty becomes that I need expertise from multiple areas in the company in order to make this all work. So now we're going to start getting to the meat of today. So this is all introductory stuff so far. So you often see statements similar to what's written up here, which basically says, hey, you know, when you do demand-driven supply chain, you don't want to do it like you used to do it with the forecast and scheduling to the forecast and planning to the forecast and building inventory to the forecast. You don't want to do that because it's all demand-driven. And the fact of the matter is, you don't have to dig very deep before you find that that popular literature is basically wrong. You still need a long-term demand plan. You have to have a basis upon which you are working. You have to have a foundation so that you can be reactive. And that's what we're going to talk about most of the rest of this session. So demand, it's simple. Demand is what customers need, how much they need, and when do they need it. And of course, where do they need it? We got a lot of logistics people here. I couldn't leave that out. Where do they need it? So it's what do they need, how much, when, and where. So that's my demand. That's what demand is. And we need forecasting to help us out for a variety of reasons. We'll get into a number of these. But the length of the forecast, how far out I look at the forecast, depends on the velocity. Remember the slide early on where we said that the velocity is going up? So I happen to like fast cars. So if you're driving a car fast, what happens if you're only looking 30 feet in front of the car or even 10 feet in front of the car? What's going to happen? Paul, can I pick on you?
You're not going to see the obstacle that might cause you.
You're going to run into something, right? If I'm going 100 miles an hour and I'm only looking 20 feet in front of the car, I'm going to hit something because I won't have enough response time. And that's one of the tricks with demand forecasting is as the velocity of industry increases, I need to be looking far enough ahead so that I can adjust my plans efficiently and quickly without causing a crash. That's tricky. It's not easy, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So there's some key characteristics of a world-class demand planning process. We're not going to do this pedantically, but the top two are interesting, and they're what we're going to focus on. Best demand planning process has a foundation on statistical models, but then builds upon that foundation with expert knowledge. I sometimes call that the voice of the boss, right? But the fact is, those of us who've been in whatever industry we're in and have developed expertise in that industry have valuable information that's hard to capture, if not impossible to capture in statistical models. And we'll get into why I can't. So there's been some research on decision making, and what it has shown is that decisions made purely on numbers, whether statistical models or financial forecasting or something like that, are exactly as good, although they might be different, but the quality of the decision making is exactly as good as experienced people making decisions from the gut. Now, you guys are in an academic environment. That's a little counterintuitive. Academics don't like to hear that. But the fact of the matter is, if I go purely statistical forecasting, my demand forecast will be okay, but it won't be a whole lot better than if a person with knowledge of the industry just did it from their gut. But if you give the person who's doing the forecast a good, solid financial or statistical model, and then ask them to approach the forecasting is adjusting that model. And the question that you're asking is, what do I know as an expert in the industry that is not reflected in this model? What are the assumptions that would cause me to think that the forecast will be different than the statistical model says? So does that make sense to everybody? I'm a little nervous right after lunch. I have a deep voice. I might be putting you to sleep. That's not allowed. Zach said if I do that, I'll never come back again. And notice that we talk here about assumptions. Assumptions need to be documented and transparent. KPIs need to be set. Measures are set at the right level. And we set a cadence. Those are also important. But we're not talking about those today. So we're talking about the top ones. All right. Let's see. Helps if I push the right button, it turns out. So let's look at the forecasting process. So demand-driven supply chain is a systems approach. It covers the whole organization. I only have half an hour. We don't want to try to do that. So we're going to focus on one aspect of it, and that's the demand forecast side of things. So what is a forecast? What people tend to think of a forecast is that's a precise estimate or a precise direction on where we're going to go. We are going to sell 250 units next week, and we're going to sell 350 units in December, right? That very precise, and it's great because you could go in and say, well, we're actually going to sell 353 units, and then we can get in a nice little debate: is it 353 or 357, right? But the fact of the matter is, you can't shoot that straight. And really, what we're trying to do with the forecast is create a reasonable picture of the future. It's a reasonable picture of the future, and the further out, the broader the range of risk around that forecast, risk in this case being measured as the likelihood of variance to the baseline. So I'm going to switch to this side. I just realized I don't have to be bound to that table, do I? And you guys may have noticed that I'm a little peripatetic. I got to move. So why do I need to get forecasting accuracy? Well, the reason I want to get better at forecasting is because it has a bottom line impact to my organization. It does cut costs out of the entire supply chain. And you can see the numbers. I'm not going to walk through every number here, but things like less inventory, better perfect order fulfillment, shorter cash to cycle times. All of these things, I think this is the most important. It produces an increase in margin. So there's a lot of very good reasons why I want to get good at this forecasting thing, right? So when we talk about forecasting, there's all kinds of tools that helps us determine cause and effect, environmental tie-ins, correlation systems, systems dynamics analysis, data quality, a wide range of different analytic tools and algorithms. And I will say all of these things are important, and I'll explain why they're important. I've already touched on it, but we're not talking about them today. Why not? I'll get there. But this is a really important question. How many of you guys are all in supply chain, which means at some level you're dealing with forecasts. You're dealing with the demand forecast, you're dealing with the supply forecast. Anybody in this room not deal with forecasts, either creating or responding to them, right? Okay, now start thinking about those forecasts. How many of you have been consistently satisfied with the quality of the forecasting in your organization? Raise your hand, because I want to meet you. And I want to talk to the people in your organization. There is a tendency, there's one person back here. Her forecasts are perfect, I was told. So the fact of the matter is, in most organizations that we deal with, in my practice, but also in my previous lives where I worked with hundreds of suppliers, people aren't satisfied with the forecast. They're frustrated by them. Now, part of it is expectations. People are expecting perfection on a forecast, and that's not reasonable or likely. But one of the problems with our forecasting is that all forecasting processes start with an assumption. The starting assumption is that people are rational. And we all believe that, right? How many of you find that the people that you work with are totally rational? All right? And what we find is perhaps people aren't quite as rational as we would like to believe. And by the way, I remember Economics 101. I don't know if they still teach it this way, but the first day of Economics 101, we were taught that the starting foundation in economics is that consumers make rational decisions. Is that still taught? It's still taught. It's wrong. And there's some really good work that shows that it's wrong, that demonstrates it's wrong. And you've got works of a guy named Dan Ariely, author of Predictably Irrational. And to be honest, Dan steals a lot from other people, but this is a really good book if you haven't read it. Another guy who got a Nobel Prize with another guy, whose name just escaped me, Daniel Kahneman, they proved that markets behave irrationally. They proved it, and yet we still teach it as an assumption. If my forecasting was totally rational, what I would expect is something approximating a bell curve. So that would mean that if this is my expected value, I did a forecast and said we're going to sell 1 million. And if I looked at all my forecasts over a long period of time across my products, 50% of the time, we would sell more than my forecast. And 50% of the time, we would sell less than my forecast. So I'm going to point to the B. Braun table there. Is that what you find? 50% of the time, you sell more than forecast and 50% less? Not at all? How about somebody else? We got the Lutron folks over here. What do you say? No? It's not distributed this way. I've never met the organization where it's distributed this way. And there's good reasons for that. Let me ask you that question in a different way. How often has actual sales exceeded the forecast? Is that a common thing? Have any of you ever seen actual sales exceed the forecast? Just a show of hands. For a year or just a month?
Oh, COVID.
Well, COVID's But generally speaking, most of the time, sales fall below the forecast. And that's true across industry. So you have a distribution that looks more like this. If this is my baseline here, every now and then I got something that falls above that forecast, but most of the curve, the area under the curve, for the more academic, is here to the left side. It's lower than what we said it would be. And actually, to be honest, this is a pretty optimistic curve. Most of the time, this red line is more like here. Okay? Does that make sense? Does that tie with your experience? Yeah, I'm getting a few nods and a few people who are starting to slumber. And so what that says is not only are our estimates, our predictions of the future consistently wrong, they are also consistently optimistic. Oh, now I'm starting to get some information that I might be able to use to improve the quality of my forecasting. And they tend to be optimistic by a lot. And what we're finding in forecasting is that estimating errors are usually, I put usually in small letters there, but sometimes they are, but usually are not a function of technique. better statistical methods, more sophisticated statistical methods. You start getting into ARIMA tools and things like that. Don't actually make a significant improvement in the quality of forecasting. And that's because psychology, otherwise known as human nature, better explains most forecasting error. And I don't know about you folks, but I don't see changing human nature as a reasonable objective for me as a manager or executive. Anybody disagree with that? Any of you think you can change human nature? I haven't figured out how to do that yet. So it just creates problems, and it's much more effective to work with human nature. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. There's a lot more things that we can talk about here than we can do in the time available, but we'll talk about a couple of them: optimism, bias, anchoring, and novel analysis. These are tendencies of thinking that most of us have most of the time. So this guy, whose name I'll butcher, but I can pronounce his first name, Bent. Bent went and looked at public works projects, and he found something very interesting. For the academics in the room, how often in statistical analysis can you look at something and say, always, the word always? It's not very often, right? That's a pretty strong word. Public works projects were always estimated overly optimistic in terms of cost and timing by between 20 and 60%. Sometimes more than that. Sometimes wildly more than that. That's pretty important. Always optimistic. Since he did this study, there have been other studies on projects where they've gotten large databases of projects. One study was on 700 defense projects in the United States. Another one was on a bunch of, I believe it was over 500 defense projects in the UK. There's been other studies on other public works projects. So he started the ball rolling in this, and what we're finding is over and over again, this is true. We're getting almost no examples of a project coming in ahead of schedule. We're getting almost no examples of a demand forecast that comes in above the forecast. Excuse me, of an actual demand coming in above the forecast. There's some. So some specific examples: rail projects in general, 45%. Infrastructure projects, 34%, road projects, 20%. This is the degree of optimism that we encountered in these types of projects. Okay? So what that ties back is that people are inherently optimistic. Now, I know people claim they're pessimists. True pessimist is a rare breed. All right? And honestly, I will guarantee you that everybody in this room is an optimist, because you wouldn't be in the positions you're in, either as a student or as a professional, if you weren't an optimist. You have to have some positive feelings about how you can make the world better or change the world in some way. Otherwise, you wouldn't even be in this room. And that's a good thing, but not necessarily what I'm forecasting. So what Bent, I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name again, found is that inaccuracy was not due to technique, but rather due to psychology. And he's a Dutch guy, and Dutch are pretty in your face with their opinions. And he said that there were two factors: delusion and deception. And delusion is, I call it optimism, and deception you could call politics. And what he found is that the greater the political pressure, the more it tended to be on the politics side of things. Now, why is that? So, I'm going to pick on you if you don't mind. Is that okay?
Yeah.
And your name is? Lucas? So Lucas, I'm your boss's boss's boss, okay? And I come to you and say, Lucas, this new product that we're putting out, this is vital to the future of the company. And we're going to do a presentation to the board, and I need your forecast. And it's really, really important that that forecast be high enough that we can get this approved. Right? Am I putting some pressure on Lucas? Yeah, do you feel the pressure? A little bit of pressure. And this is a kind of rarefied environment, right? So you can imagine that all of us have been through this, right? There's something that somebody in management, somebody that we respect, hopefully, really would like. And they're afraid that it won't get approved. And that's what happens with those public works projects very often. So sometimes the issue is deception or politics or that kind of pressure, like what Lucas was experiencing there. But it also starts with some optimism, right? So somewhere or other, I put it in my pocket. You're more observant than I am.
That's all you do.
And so Daniel Kahneman, in his research, and you remember he's the guy who proved that markets behave irrationally, and got a Nobel Prize for it. Imagine that. He found in his research that people are consistently optimistic and often unreasonably optimistic. And there's a great story. In Israel, they wanted to improve the secondary education system. And what they were wanting to do is improve the quality of thinking that was coming out of school so that people were more able to do critical thinking. And so they brought in a bunch of experts, and they asked all the experts, okay, they designed a new curriculum, and they said, okay, you guys are all experts, you've all been involved in doing these kinds of programs. How long will it take us to do that? And what they did is you guys might be familiar with a similar exercise. Before talking about it, everybody wrote down their estimate, their best estimate, and then they put those best estimates up on the wall, and all of the estimates were between 12 and 18 months. So between 12 and 18 months, you could change the curriculum of the entire Israeli secondary school system. Now, these are experts. These are people who should know their stuff. Anybody know how long it actually took? Probably not, unless you read the book. It actually took 5.5 years. So the experts were wildly optimistic about what it would take to make this happen. And interestingly, Kahneman took a couple of the folks that had been in that room and said, let's go research what other people have actually done. And when they did the research, they found that 50% of the time that school systems tried to make changes of similar magnitude, 50% of the time they never did it. Okay? And of those that did accomplish the change, on average, it was 10 years. So the experts, who should have known that it should take 10 years, were telling 18 months to 24 months. So what does that say? At some level, you might be cautious about trusting the experts on their estimates, right? So people tend to estimate their capabilities or the sales or whatever they're estimating by 20 to 40%. Use that as a rule of thumb. Now, it can be a lot more, as I've given some examples. But this is not a bad rule of thumb when you're working on forecasting and developing forecasts. And by the way, this applies to sales forecasts. It applies to timing. If you think about projects, how many projects come in ahead of schedule? It's not a long list. It comes to budgeting. How much is it going to cost us to do something? These tendencies are the same across those. So we've talked about optimism, a bit ad nauseum, I suppose. Now let's talk about anchoring. This is a tendency for people to imprint a value and use that imprint as a reference for the next thing they do. So I've just bought something online, and now somebody's asked me to estimate how much we're going to spend on a project. What I just bought in line is going to influence my answer. It might be subtle, but it will influence me. And if you think about it, this makes sense. Because if in our hunter-gatherer days, what are the odds that if I saw a tiger, that the next thing I'd see is a polar bear, right? Generally, as I'm going through my environment, whatever I see is indicative of what I'm going to see next. Okay. So how can we as forecasters use this to our advantage? The tendency for people to approach I'm going to cover another thing, and then I'll come back to that. The next thing is novel analysis. This is the tendency for people to approach each new decision or forecast as a new exercise. Is it down to 1 minute?
No, one question. I'm sorry.
Okay. I was panicking. It went from 5 to 1 there.
Okay.
So the fundamental question that we want to ask in the last 5 minutes, or 4.5 at this point, is must forecasts feel like a spin of the roulette wheel? Is it just a guess? And it's more than a guess. And there's some tools that we can use. And one of them is called reference class forecasting, and the other one that I want to bring up is called conversational PERT. So very quickly, give you 15 seconds, write down the last 2 digits of your phone number. And then write down how much you'd be willing to pay for this bottle of Kuka Lake Vineyard Semi-Dry Riesling 2020. And I know a couple of you in the room like wine, so you might have a really good estimate on this. Now, we're hardly doing this as a study. All I wanted to do is clarify that what you wrote down first, even though it was totally not correlated to what we're actually asking about, generally would influence your estimate. And interestingly, even people who know about that are influenced. And you need a pretty large sample size to prove that out. So one of the tools that we use to help with this is something called a price ladder. And this also can apply to other things. So in this particular example, now I've given you some prices. Now I've given you, these are similar wines in a similar class. Would this affect how you do your estimate? And the answer is yes. And do any of you, I think I'm going to run out of time if I do this anecdote, so that's okay, my own fault. Actually, I'm going to give it anyway.
No, do it.
So
You're going to buy me a drink later.
I'm game with that. So any of you remember, some of you this is way too young, but if you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, the automotive industry was launching new cars on a regular basis. They'd launch the new car, and within weeks, sometimes days, they started providing rebates on those cars. And those rebates were enormous. I remember there were rebates in some cars as much as $7,000. So please buy this new car that we just launched, and we're going to give you $7,000 off. And anybody who really thought about it started saying, well, wait a second, don't they know what price people are willing to pay? And the answer is yes and no. Because what every automotive company was doing was the exact same mistake. What they were doing is they were going to customers like you guys and saying, how much would you be willing to pay for this car? And we've established people are optimistic. And also that they can be influenced by anchoring, right? And what was happening is people were consistently saying, I'd be willing to pay $30,000 for this car, when in reality, it was only going to be $36,000. So they launched the car, it wouldn't sell, they wouldn't get bites on it, they'd have to discount it by giving rebates to get people in line. And so I was part of the team at General Motors who started implementing reference class forecasting so we got better estimates, and it made a huge difference in the quality of our estimates of what people would pay. Now the second tool is conversational PERT. Any of you familiar with PERT? A couple of you. If you've had a project management class, you may have encountered it. But PERT is really an equation. It says, what's your most optimistic forecast? What's your best estimate? What's your most pessimistic forecast? Do a formula, optimistic times 4 times best estimate plus pessimistic divided by 6. So it's just a weighted average. It turns out it's almost useless, despite what the textbooks say. However, it's not totally useless. What makes it useful is the questions that I can ask about it. It's not about the equation, it's about the conversation. So what I want to do when I do a forecast, and you obviously want to, this takes energy, so you want to do this, focus on the things where it really counts. What I want to do is ask these questions. What assumptions lead to the most optimistic forecast? And which of those assumptions can I influence? If we're talking about the economy in China, I can't influence that. But if you're talking about our advertising spend, I can influence that. And then what assumptions would lead to the most pessimistic outcome? And how can we prevent those? In other words, how can we influence whether or not those happen or the degree to which they happen? This conversation is very valuable, and it helps me refine my forecast tremendously. The equation, it just helps lead to this conversation. And the last point is work very hard with your teams to not do a unique forecast. Make sure that the team looks at changes to forecast volume or forecast dollars based on changes to assumptions, which means they have to start with the baseline. When somebody comes in one month and says, we're going to sell 1,000, the next month says, well, we're going to sell 1,500, why? What is causing that? What has changed since last month? Because what most likely happened is I sat at my desk, I got to get that forecast done for Zach. What do I think? I think it's going to be 1,500. Without having looked at my previous forecast or looked at the statistical forecast, I've simply put down a number because I was under pressure to do so. So make sure that people explain the change in assumptions to explain a change in forecast. With that, I am definitely out of time. We did talk about 3 tools: reference class forecasting, conversational PERT, and assumption-based changes, and I hope you found it useful.
Sneak one question in. We got
one question
right here. There, you're close.
Super interesting, thank you. You didn't mention AI. AI is becoming this popular topic, this black box where there's a ton of training data that goes in and it spits out apparently some intelligent answer, but it's difficult to understand the underlying assumptions. What are your thoughts around how the industry is going to evolve with AI influencing whether it's a co-pilot or AGI going forward, if you have?
So I've been reading up on it. I haven't had a chance to play with it yet, in the context of forecasting. As AI is developing, it looks like increasingly we're going to have more specialized AI tools. So my guess is, if it's not out there already, we will very shortly have AI forecasting tools. If the AI is not providing you the assumptions that go into the forecast, then throw it out. Because it always comes down to the assumptions. What is it that's driving this forecast? And you know that with to write a paper for Zach's class, you can go into AI and you can tell it to cite your sources. That's what you need on the forecast as well. The equivalent is cite the assumptions. Okay?